So good evening, everybody. Venerable Children is gone tonight. She'll be back in a couple days. It was kind of a quickly decided trip, and she would like us to spend the evening thinking about the six far-reaching practices. So let's start by setting our motivation for the evening. So these practices contain the whole of the Buddha's path. And they're really practices for bodhisattvas, so those in the Mahayana vehicle. And bodhisattvas' real job is to help other beings, mostly by teaching them and by example. So this verse by Dharmakirti, I think, quite encapsulates what I see as the motivation for looking into this topic. And he said, in order to destroy suffering, compassionate ones apply themselves to the methods. And if you don't know the cause for creating a result, it's difficult to explain it to others. So this evening we'll take some time to zoom through maybe the six perfections, which contain the whole of the path. So we're just going to touch on things here and there and try to train our minds in generosity, ethical conduct, fortitude, joyous effort, concentration, and wisdom. And we do this in order to fulfill our own aims, and we do it also to fulfill the aims of others and to be of benefit to them. So as we think about all the various people that we may have special connections with, especially on this evening, let's expand our care and concern to every sentient being. So the six far-reaching practices are basically a complete path of method and wisdom. And this is a path that's unmistaken and complete. And that's important to know, because we could follow many paths, but we need to make sure that we're getting to the goal that we want to. So we need to have a path that's unmistaken and one that's complete, that has all the causes and conditions. And so the Buddha said that these are the causes and conditions for awakening. He kind of condensed them into three, which are great compassion, bodhicitta, and this perfect method. So without great compassion, we really, although we could free ourselves from cyclic existence, we could never become a Buddha and have omniscient wisdom. Because great compassion is needed for bodhicitta, which is the primary cause of full awakening. And this perfect method, the collections of merit and wisdom, is the complete set of causes, and those are often explained as the six far-reaching practices. So because we've been studying Aryadeva, the various verses that we have been looking at, and also because it's impossible to generate bodhicitta without some sense of renunciation, I wanted to just place this in context of we talk about the three levels of motivation. The first being the modest one, where a person is really kind of looking out for their next rebirth, if we've even gotten to that point. And so we want to practice in common with people who have that motivation, and they're thinking mostly about impermanence and death, to help them to turn away from doing things that are unwholesome in this life, and to help them to think about creating constructive actions and generating merit so that they can have a good rebirth in the next life. And then beyond that, because that's really not enough to develop renunciation, we really need to think about the full situation we're in samsara. And so we have to really think about the disadvantages and the defects of cyclic existence. We have to recognize these and recognize them in our experience, because we'll never be able to generate renunciation without that. And we have to generate they say a kind of revulsion. And it's not a revulsion for life, it's not a revulsion for living. It's a revulsion for this process of samsara, uncontrollable rebirth under the control of ignorance, afflictions, karma. And so we need to contemplate that and understand how karma works and how the results of karma come about. So these are the actions. Karma are actions, and they establish imprints on our mind, and those ripen into the various experiences that we have. And so as long as we're doing even virtuous or non-virtuous actions, we're going to continue to be born and reborn in cyclic existence. Even virtuous actions are a cause of rebirth. They just are a cause of a better rebirth. So we have to really take a stock of the whole picture and try to really expand our thinking to really want to strive for liberation. And with that motivation, if we had that spontaneous, or that's not the word, a genuine feeling for renunciation, our lives would have so much meaning and purpose. I think the amount of energy that we would have would be incredible. And if we could then augment that with this kind of compassion that takes in the needs, the feelings, the situation, the suffering of others, then we would be in a situation where we could generate a kind of bodhicitta that has no favoritism at all. We wouldn't be especially caring for just one person. We would have our concern going to all beings and wishing them to be free of every suffering, so wanting to lead them to awakening. And so can you imagine what that would be like, to have that kind of aspiration in your mind, and how your day would be, how your interactions would go if that was spontaneous, strong, and dominating your experience. It's really, this is really what the Mahayana practice is about. So this is what we try to train ourselves in, and we know from our own experience that what we do habitually is what we do. So it's no different with things that are virtuous or non-virtuous. And we have friends that, a woman who was just here, Mary Grace, had to go into a really huge surgery, and she was doing certain kind of practices going into the surgery, and she came out of the surgery doing the same practices. It was able to sustain. And so, our mind, the intention that we have is very powerful. And we all know our habits are very strong. So it's not like this is a leap of faith to think that we can create new habits. We do it all the time. So it's really a matter of what we're doing with our mind. So this is this mind of bodhicitta is one that has an aspiration to be of the greatest benefit to all beings by becoming enlightened. And so it takes that responsibility, and that's on the aspirational level. But then there's the place where you get to where you want to actually venture off and do that. And that is where these bodhisattva practices, these 6 far-reaching practices come in, because these are the bodhisattva deeds, and taking the bodhisattva vow is a part of that. These are the method, and this is how we can free ourselves and then help others by teaching them, by being an example, and maybe more. So for me, I can't really think about these, teaching these. I guess I can think about each of these separately, but I can't think about teaching them without seeing how they all interrelate and kind of getting the big picture first. It doesn't work for me just to go through the 6. I have to think of them together and get kind of the bigger picture in my mind. And the first thing that I think is important is to realize that these aren't so much behaviors as much as they are state of mind. In fact, they're not external behaviors. So generosity is a state of mind. Fortitude is a state of mind. And my MO in life is always to go right to an action behavior, but these are states of mind. They're not external behaviors. We're trying to enhance our intention. So, and in this regard, the method aspect of the path enhances our wisdom because we purify our mind and we enrich it by cultivating constructive actions and merit. And this makes the mind more receptive to realizing emptiness. And then the reverse is also true, that cultivating wisdom helps you in method because you're actually doing it in a more full way, because these practices, almost by definition, are involved within the sphere of emptiness, within understanding emptiness to actually do these practices. It's not just generosity alone, it's generosity held within emptiness that, and for the benefit of all sentient beings, that makes these far-reaching. So as we work on the method side of the path, it actually helps the wisdom side to increase. And we can see that in our own experience as we do, say, offering service. My experience in living here is that it makes my mind more able to understand the teachings. And so this is like one of the benefits of meritorious activities. They're like clearing the mind. And so this helps us to eventually to get rid of all the afflictions, all the obscurations, both afflictive and cognitive obscurations. So without the method side of the path, you wouldn't be able to become a Buddha. You need both wings of the bird, as they say. So you need to practice these two together, the method and the wisdom. And then the other, I think for me, a really important point to always keep in mind is that compassion is what underlies each of these 6 far-reaching practices. So I'd like to first, because I'm not going to spend a lot of time on each one, I have running through my mind that from when I was at these teachings this summer, that really all of the practices and all of the teachings are leading us to wisdom, held in a certain way so that we care about all beings. So I'm hoping to spend a little more time on that one tonight. But we should at least make sure that we know what each of these practices is. And so these are almost like definitions here. So generosity is physical, verbal, and mental actions that are based on a kind thought and the willingness to give. And ethical conduct is restraining from non-virtue. So this is things like the 10 non-virtues. And fortitude is the ability to remain calm and undisturbed in the face of things like harm from others, physical and mental suffering, and various difficulties that come up. Joyous effort is taking delight in virtue. And meditative stabilization is the ability to remain focused on a constructive object without distraction. So it's important to remember that it's a virtuous object. And wisdom is the ability to distinguish between conventional and ultimate truth. So that relates to the two truths, understanding conventional and ultimate truths. And then to discern what to practice and what to abandon on the path. And then these 6, we try to practice all of them at once, but they actually are easier to do in order. So we're encouraged to focus more on the earlier ones and then build up to the later ones, although we practice all of them simultaneously. But in your own practice, you know, if you kind of take stock of where you are in your practice and you do it in terms of these 6, if you find that you have a lot of difficulty being generous, I think that it's good to kind of realize that this one comes first and spend more time there, because it will make the other ones easier in the long run. And that's easy to understand when you think about a mind that isn't generous. You might say is a mind that's greedy, or it's easier to get attached to things then. And when you get attached to things, it's easier to get yourself into trouble with your ethical conduct, because you're like wanting all these things, and we will actually go to any extent to get what we want. We have that capability, all of us. So, yeah, I'd say that's, many of us have seen that that's possible. Without any kind of restraint, we can get really deluded and do all kinds of crazy things. So then your ethical conduct is kind of out the window. So if you didn't have all these attachments and greed going on in the mind, you'd have fewer things to get in trouble about. Does that make any sense? It's just kind of basic. And with ethical conduct, it's easier to develop fortitude, because you're not getting yourself in all kinds of situations. You have more control of your afflictions with ethical conduct. You're having an easier time remaining calm. And with fortitude, it's easier to accomplish joyous effort. Because with fortitude, we actually do remain calm in difficult situations. With ethical conduct, I think we're kind of facing those situations to try to control ourselves, but even we see here that we still can't control our anger. But as we develop our fortitude, we'll be able to bear hardships, and we'll actually have a more of an internal kind of calm that doesn't let you get so rattled, and then it's easier to maintain a joy with your effort, and even in practice. And joyous effort, without that, you'll never really be able to develop meditative stabilization, because that is not so easy to do. It takes time. And even having the right conditions isn't so easy, so it takes continuous effort over time. This is what the masters have told us. And then meditative stabilization is necessary in order to develop a kind of wisdom that's sharp and clear. If we want to penetrate the meaning on a topic, we have to have a mind that we can concentrate so that we can actually stay with what we're contemplating. And especially when you get to things that are more and more subtle. So in that way you can see how these all work together. And I think it creates a better picture of trying to look at each of them individually as seeing how they function together. They describe three main functions of the 6 far-reaching practices, and I want to mostly focus on the third one tonight. These are to accomplish the welfare of other sentient beings, to accomplish our own aims and the aims of others, and then also to receive a precious human life in the future so that we can continue to practice. So that third one is, I think, kind of important to think about, because we're trying to direct our lives so that we can have a series of good rebirths, so that we can continue to practice and become fully awakened. But if we aren't able to be generous, then it's going to be difficult to have the resources in future lives, because we're going to be too poor to have the resources to practice. And we need resources in order to practice the Dharma. And if without ethical conduct, we won't have a rebirth that's suitable, because one of the main, the principal cause of an upper rebirth is ethical conduct. And we need a human life. With having fortitude developed, it's easier to have good friends who support us in our Dharma practice. And when we don't have, if we lose our anger a lot, you can see just in this life that we have difficulty having friends because we're hard to be with. So by practicing fortitude that can bear difficulties, which is something that we cultivate and is quite in austerity, that creates the cause for having a personality that's more pleasing, and to have companions, good companions who encourage us along the path. So this is, it's good to think of the benefits of developing these things. it's good to want to have these things. This is a kind of desire that's wholesome. So if we're not able to follow through on projects and complete things, this will become a hindrance in terms of benefiting others, and it will get in the way of our being able to cultivate joyous effort. In the future, in our future lives, we'll have more difficulty completing virtuous projects. So this joyous effort that we can cultivate in this life is actually the cause for having these abilities in future lives, to be able to be successful in our constructive activities. So when things aren't going well for us now, I think it's helpful to realize that sometimes we really don't have all the causes in order. We're fighting our karma almost sometimes. It doesn't mean that you give up, but it means you have to kind of focus more on the causes than the results. So a person who develops meditative stabilization has an easier time controlling the afflictions. And if we don't control our afflictions, it's really easy to create negative karma or do negative actions. With our mind being more peaceful and stable, we'll have an easier time not getting distracted and not getting just pulled around by uncontrollable thoughts and emotions. And as we develop our wisdom in this life, it creates the causes to meet teachers in future lives. It will help us to discriminate between teachers that are suitable and teaching the proper path and those that aren't. It will help us to know what to practice and what to abandon. So even in this life, although we can't maybe perfect all of these things, we can see that just by how they've described what happens in future lives, that we're creating causes. This is the causes that we're creating by doing this now. And then I think that because the way meditation was established in this country, many people, including myself, have had, I think, kind of wrong notions about meditative stabilization. And I think that it's helpful to keep in mind always that it's not necessarily a Buddhist activity to have meditative stabilization. And it seems almost hard to imagine, but you could develop quite strong abilities to concentrate, and it doesn't mean you necessarily going to not have afflictions. This is what I mean here is, if you don't cultivate the first 4 of the practices and you were only to cultivate meditative stabilization without having a broader context, which is how it was introduced in our country in my youth, there was not the big context really, there was just trying to concentrate. That can lead to problems. You might even gain abilities, but you wouldn't have an ethical dimension necessarily to your behavior. So it actually could become a cause of afflictions. And I think we've heard a few stories about that here. Okay, so I think we'll move in a little bit to the specific practices of generosity first. And we often talk about 4 kinds: giving material possessions or money, giving protection from danger and fear, giving love, and giving the Dharma. So what I'd like people to do now is to close their eyes, pretend you're a bodhisattva, and think about applying this practice to your life. I'm just going to read things that the Buddha wrote that a bodhisattva should reflect on. What I give away is mine. What I keep at home is not mine. What I give away has essence. What I keep at home has no essence. What I give away will bring pleasure at another future time. What I keep at home will only bring pleasure right now. What I give away does not need to be protected. What I keep at home must be protected. My desire for what I give away will be exhausted. My desire for what I keep at home increases. What I give away, I do not think of as mine. What I keep at home, I think of as mine. What I give away is no longer an object of grasping. What I keep at home is an object of grasping. What I give away is not a source of fear. What I keep at home causes fear. What I give away supports the path to awakening. What I keep at home supports the party of Mara. You can open up your eyes when you're ready. So with each of these practices, we need to take time and think about our lives. And I like this because it's like just all about our stuff. And it's easy to see. We all, even though we've given away most of our possessions, all of us, we find things to be attached to. You can get attached to a pencil around here. My favorite pencil. So I think it's important to remember, once again, that when we practice generosity, these can be actual things that we give. They can be imagined things. It really has to do with the motivation and awareness of emptiness. And by doing this, our minds can become very joyful, and it helps us to progress along the path. So this is one, this mind of poverty that we sometimes have. That's why I think they maybe recommend us to do mandala offerings, just to, help our mind expand and become joyful. So with far-reaching ethical conduct, we're trying to abandon harming others. And for a bodhisattva, this really has to do with getting rid of the self-centered attitude, which makes it even broader in a way. So we're trying to restrain from harm, and we're trying to establish a foundation where we can engage in virtuous activities. And these help us to try to be beneficial and work for the benefit of others. And as we do this, we'll become more aware of our afflictions, and we'll become more skilled in counteracting them. And this will allow us to become more peaceful, and our ethical conduct will become more pure, I guess you could say. But things get in the way of that, and this list of 4, I think, are helpful because they kind of point to, well, if you're finding that you're having trouble with ethical conduct in a certain way, maybe look at these things. One is not knowing what's to be abandoned and what's to be practiced. And all of us have had discussions recently about how just holding any kind of precepts has been helpful in that way, and looking at the 10 destructive actions and the 10 constructive actions. It's kind of lifting a level of confusion. but sometimes we just don't know. So that could be one way where we run into problems. Or we could have a lack of respect for the precepts. We haven't really seen the good qualities that they will afford for us. Haven't really thought about them deeply, so they aren't really then affecting our minds enough. We could be careless. Usually that's common around here with sweeping floors. You just kind of get on automatic, and then there's a bug, and that happens a lot. And that's a thing that we can do something about. And also strong afflictions. So we have to then learn how to work with all of these things. And as Shantideva says, that the mind that's without, when you don't have mindfulness, you're caught between the fangs of the afflictions. So mindfulness is really important, and introspection, where you're able to kind of know what you want to be practicing and then have a little spy that's watching your mind, like say as you go through the day, watching your speech. Usually, when we do our prayers at meals is a good time to kind of bring back to mind, so we're not kind of just on automatic all day, of what was your motivation in the morning and what specifically are you trying to work on to change your behaviors during the day and reestablish those. Which is why we stop during the day to do things, so that we can take a moment to reestablish what our motivation was and become mindful of them. And it's also important to have, I think, integrity. This is where we care about our values, where we value ourselves. We have a kind of respect for ourselves, that we want to live by our values, and then have consideration for others. So these are factors in the mind that sometimes are present strongly, sometimes are present weakly, in a weak fashion, sometimes are not. And you can identify those in your mind. You can see, I really wasn't living up to my own values in that moment. That's a lack of integrity. I find that in myself. Or I really am not really considering others when I'm in this state of mind. And those are things that we can change. And by doing that, our ethical conduct will just improve. It's kind of like the antidotes. With having ethical conduct, we have in one of our prayers, it's the basis of all good qualities. So, although we're trying to become Buddhas, we need these precious human rebirths along the way. And so this is ethical conduct is a main cause of fortunate rebirths, which means upper rebirths. Then we move into patience or fortitude. So here we've forsaken anger. This is the ability to remain undisturbed in the face of harm or suffering. And it's not being passive. It's a clarity of mind, and it allows you to act or not to act. So this ability to bear, others' destructive actions, when you have that developed, you can hold these things with a mind that stays in virtue and stays with pure conduct. So in the Lam Rim, they describe these three kinds that usually I try to think about when I'm trying to work something out with anger. Sometimes I go to these because I find them kind of helpful. That fortitude is being undisturbed by harm from others, so kind of accepting, how do I say that to myself? Accept the suffering. Disregard the harm. That's how I usually say it to myself. Disregard the harm. Accept the suffering in my mind, which is the second. Voluntarily accepting suffering. It's not saying be a doormat, but just I usually try to look at a situation and try to disregard what I usually say to myself, disregard the perceived harm. I'm perceiving harm from another's, and help myself to accept the suffering in myself of the whole situation. And then this fortitude of practicing, looking at the conditions that give rise to this, which means kind of turning the mind to the Dharma. So when we talk about like bearing or voluntarily accepting suffering, this doesn't really mean that we're becoming doormats. It doesn't mean that we aren't going to protect ourselves or that we're going to allow people to do things that are kind of dreadful and harmful. That's not what it's about. To me, my experience of this is more when I'm sitting on the cushion, when something is disturbing my mind, it's kind of like I let down the whole resistance to the experience, and I allow myself to just at first disregard the harm. Well, I'm not disregarding it. I'm having these thoughts kind of attacking me. But I say that to myself, and it helps to start diffuse it. And then I accept the suffering that's in my mind. And that, again, helps me to calm down. And then I try to look at what are the conditions. There's not a bad person there where I'm perceiving this harm to come from. Everyone's just caught in a quagmire of many causes and conditions. So by doing this kind of reflections and working in the multitude of ways that you can work to develop fortitude, we'll actually be able to act with a lot of compassion and with a lot of very assertively in situations, but we won't have to have anger in our mind in challenging situations. And then there's a fortitude where we accept a kind of hardship just to practice the Dharma. And really, we have to be able to do that in order to continue to practice, because a lot of these things don't just come easily. We're like swimming upstream all the time. And, well, the Dharma, because we're conditioned by ignorance, the Dharma is actually challenging us all the time. We have these things that we have various assumptions that we hold, or preconceptions that we hold, various prejudices, and the Dharma is meant to be, trying to undermine those. So things come up, resistance comes up, fear comes up. Even when you start to realize emptiness, they say a fear can come up, and you have to have a kind of fortitude to stay, with the experience. And we've all had the experience of how the self-centered thought can kind of just sabotage us in a lot of ways. And we have to have a lot of fortitude just in bearing our own internal states based on these kind of thoughts of excessive self-concern. Because when we start to challenge the self-centered thought, it doesn't just kind of go away. Usually creates a little bit of a civil war. If you have to be able to kind of bear it and work through it. But as we continue to do this, we'll gain a lot more confidence and conviction, because we'll see that the Dharma, the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha are able to help us. And we'll start to have more understanding when we contemplate the subjects related to wisdom, the meaning of the scriptures. And by having this kind of conviction in our mind, it will be easier for us to continue. So with fortitude, we can actually bear things that we couldn't bear before. We'll have much stronger minds and much deeper resources within ourselves to go through our day, to go through our lives, to deal with the things that come up, to cultivate our Dharma practice, and to benefit others. And we need to have a lot of fortitude to do that, but it can't just be that alone. What is it? It said, well, you have to have the joyous effort, or you just can't keep going. It's just the way it is. We're just wired that way, I think. And so effort without joy leads to fatigue. That's what Tsongkhapa said. So it's not just any effort. When we think about effort, we're talking about joyous effort. And as we have more fortitude, it will be easier to have a mind that's joyful. And this is a joyous effort is a mind that takes delight in developing virtuous qualities and takes delight in doing virtuous activities. It's kind of enthusiasm. And it helps us to engage in difficult work. It helps us to sustain our Dharma practice. And all the attainments follow after effort. So in terms of method and wisdom, it's involved with both. And of course, when we first start out, this is rather weak, but we learn how to become more steadfast. And we continue on, and it increases. So these 4 powerful ways to counteract the laziness that inhibits joyous effort. This list, I think, is quite helpful. Most people here have benefited from thinking about these things. How do we counteract the laziness that gets in the way of our joyous effort? So one of them is aspiration. We think about the benefits of joyous effort, and we think about the faults of laziness. We have kind of appreciation. Appreciation is something that has studied something, and it's not like in passing. It's actually understands something. It appreciates it because it's looked into it. So with this kind of aspiration that we're trying to develop, it's based on an appreciation, an interest, this aspiration to develop joyous effort. And we have that aspiration because we've looked into it and we see the benefits. And then a steadfastness. We cultivate a kind of stability. And especially in terms of, we try to avoid not completing activities. I remember when Venerable, what's Yanksi? You remember his sister's name?
Sinla.
Venerable Sinla was here. She started reading one of our books here, and she would not leave until she finished the book. She was like, when she started something, she finished it. So she was taking notes on the book Nonviolent Communication when she was here. So she just like, no, I have to finish this before I can leave. And I was like, oh, this is that. She's making sure that, she doesn't just keep starting things and stopping them. And then the third is joy. So we want to try to bring that up in our mind when we're trying to benefit others. And then rest, which is trying to maintain a sense of balance of the body and mind. Taking a break, resting with the intention of we're resting so that we can return to a virtuous activity. So it's not like it's not like a self-indulgent distraction. And we have to learn how to discern really what that means. Most of us don't come here with that too clear. We've had a lot of independence, and we just do whatever we want. And for myself, I've had a lot of self-indulgent distraction in my life, I would say. So we try to restore ourselves by rest. And this helps, a joyous mind can help us with our confidence too. So we talked a little bit about how meditative stabilization, or the serenity, is found among Buddhists and non-Buddhists. But in the Bodhisattva practices, it's definitely based on refuge in the 3 jewels. And it's motivated by bodhicitta. And the aim of practicing meditative stabilization in the Bodhisattva practices is to actualize the wisdom realizing emptiness for the purpose of attaining full awakening. So it's really important to hold in mind these motivations, because even as you develop any skill in meditative concentration, it's quite nice. And you can become attached to these states of mind. And it's probably very easy. So this mind of serenity, it has a stability on the object and a kind of vibrant alertness and mental clarity. So in order to develop this kind of concentration, we have to have certain conditions. And there are 6 internal and external conditions that are needed, and all 6 are needed to develop full serenity. And so it's important to recognize that and not get frustrated if you're not thinking that you're doing very well in this practice. It's important to educate yourself, follow these instructions here. This is really like the cookbook recipe for how to do this. And unless you, I think, understand these things, you can easily get frustrated and just keep moving on to different situations, thinking one's going to be better than the next. So you have to have, of the 6 conditions have to do with a favorable place, clear and correct understanding of the methods, be free from coarse desires, have few desires, which we can work on all of these things now, be satisfied and content, be free from involvement in worldly activities and all kinds of commotion, and live in pure ethical conduct. So all of those 6 we can do now. So that's the first thing. We need these 6 internal and external conditions. We have to have studied the meditation instructions and the major scriptures on serenity. So we learn what the 5 faults and the 8 antidotes are. We have to understand the 9 stages of calm abiding. We have to understand the 6 powers and how they relate to each other. We have to seek guidance from our spiritual mentor. And it's advised that you do it that way in Lama Tsongkhapa's text, although he says it's possible not to, for seeking what object of meditation that you would select for your object of serenity. But it's really advised that you do that through understanding what object would be most suitable for you, and in that it's probably best to get guidance from your spiritual mentor. I think some people can figure it out for themselves over the long haul, but they only probably figure that out from conversations with their spiritual mentor. And the Buddha had many objects that he described. And so when Lama Tsongkhapa describes this, he talks about what your kind of temperament is, would have something to do with which object would be most suitable. So like for myself, I find that when we've studied this 5 hindrances, and I think about those different ones, I see that, sometimes I think like, well, you have all of these. But what I find gets in the way a lot of times in meditation is a kind of restlessness in my mind at some times. So that's, for me, the main antidote, according to the teachings, is to use stabilization on the breath. And so there are times when I do that because I can recognize that my mind is restless and I'm just jumping. And as you have more experience with meditation, you kind of find how to work with your mind to get it more stable. But when you're doing a retreat to develop calm abiding fully, then it's going to be a little different than the kind of situation that we are in our practices here. It's a different structure to your sessions completely than what we're doing. So you need to read and understand that so you know exactly what to do. You have to learn how to recognize mental excitement and laxity. Those are the main things that are going to impede the mind. So mental excitement impedes the stability of the mind. It doesn't allow it to remain one-pointed. And laxity impedes the kind of clarity or freshness of the mind because the mind is too withdrawn inside. When we completely develop calm abiding, we'll have a mental and physical pliancy. which will be, I think, fantastic. Because we'll have very serviceable bodies and minds that won't be obstructions and hindrances to having concentration. Can you imagine that? The mind and the body fully, I mean, you can kind of do it in your meditation. I do this to work with pain a lot of times. It works well, in my experience, to really concentrate the mind and just watch how the pain lessens and quits being a distraction. I think I'm better with physical pain than mental pain sometimes, because I have to work things out, seems like. But you can really, I think that we have a taste of that in our own practice, actually. I think from what I learned this summer, there's a kind of mental and physical pliancy that comes from concentration, but then as we move into wisdom, which is where we're going next, there's another kind of mental and physical pliancy that develop when you're doing insight meditation, and they're stronger. You know, you have to develop it first. First, in order, moving into wisdom now, you first have to have calm abiding developed in order to realize emptiness. And if you have calm abiding developed, you've developed this pliancy, actually, mental and physical pliancy. But then, you know, as you are working on your analytical understanding of emptiness, you're using emptiness as the object then. So what they explained is that, we've learned this here, that the force of the analysis makes the pliancy arise. Right? That's what it is, the union of serenity and insight, is when the analysis makes arise the pliancy. And so that they described this summer as it's actually different, and it's stronger, and actually your concentration is even stronger yet. It sounded really good. Like, let's go there. But backing up to wisdom, there's three kinds of wisdom that are described that are far-reaching. One is the understanding of emptiness. One is the 5 fields of knowledge, logic, grammar, poetry, different topics and skills that we need to benefit sentient beings, essentially. And then the wisdom knowing how to benefit sentient beings. And here we're going to emphasize the wisdom realizing emptiness. And we cannot liberate ourselves from cyclic existence without attaining, without this wisdom that realizes emptiness. So the method I wanted to take for presenting this has to do with taking it from the standpoint of what is hindering us from seeing reality as it is, and this is ignorance. So when we develop far-reaching wisdom, which is this direct perception of emptiness, of course we're supported by the method side of the path, the bodhicitta, because we're doing this in a bodhisattva context. And the meditation on emptiness will end up having 2 kinds: the space-like, which is when you're on the cushion, and the illusion-like meditation when you're off the cushion. But let's take this from the standpoint of well, I think I better stay with this because I want to explain this from a sutra, because I find this to be something that I'm thinking about right now, so that's how I'm teaching this tonight. Sorry. So stay with the outline here. So space-like meditation is the actual meditation on emptiness, and that is the selflessness of persons and of phenomena, which you are in a state of meditative equipoise. And then what is that selflessness of persons and phenomena? That, I think, will become a little more clear as we go through this. But we essentially know that that things don't exist from their own side, that they're dependent on causes and conditions, parts, and established through thought, language, that they're merely designated through thought. So this was explained in a sutra, and it's called the sutra called The Question of Upali. And in this sutra, when he says the world, he's referring to the entire universe, the environmental world as well as the inhabitants, all the sentient beings. And in it says these variegated, beautiful blossoming flowers in these gorgeous blazing mansions of gold. So this is what the gods in the god realms have, these blazing mansions of gold. These don't have any kind of creator at all. They are established by the force of thought. The world is conceived by the force of thought. These are the words of the Buddha. And so here what the Buddha is saying is that all phenomena, both internal and external, like the environment and the internal phenomena of sentient beings, persons and all these are established by the force of thought. And here this refers to thought and language, that we designate things by thought and language. And Nagarjuna expresses the same thing when he has the first line of a quote that he has. It says, "The world has as its condition ignorance." And here this world again is talking both about the external world of the environment, but principally to sentient beings who are the inhabitants of that world. So ignorance is the primary condition. And Nagarjuna says this in another place too, where he explains this, the meaning. And he says, first one has the thought I. And then based on that thought I, well, actually then the translator redid this. He says, first one thinks I, and then thinking I, having that thought I, one thinks mine. And then the thoughts I and mine, these are these misconceptions of the wrong view of the transitory collection. That's the technical term for that, in reference to the I and mine. These two sorts of wrong views are here referred to as ignorance. So this is the ignorance that we're talking about. The condition that we have is ignorance. And when we're subject to this misconception, so when we're subject to it, doesn't mean we always are. When we're subject to it, we misconceive the nature of the I. We have this wrong view of the perishable transitory collection, or the personal identity as being real. We think that it's real, we think it's autonomous, we think it exists from its own side. So then with that wrong view of the I, or the wrong view of the mind, then we discriminate I and mine and other. So now we've got self and others going. And then we're attached. This is the foundation of the attachment that we have to things that we interpret as being agreeable or desirable for the self, for the I, and those things we interpret as being mine. And then we develop aversion, even animosity, hatred, and anger towards things that are disagreeable to the I or to the mind, things that are in our interests. And this is basically the process of ignorance. This is the ignorance that we are talking about here. I think this is what we want to take to the cushion and look for, because it's quite apparent sometimes, and sometimes not. With this ignorance, we engage in activities which are like karma. Those karmas make causal propensities in our mind stream that are in like a causal state. So now this is kind of moving into the 12 links, actually. When later on, when other conditions are met, those imprints or propensities within our mind stream will ripen into our future experiences of suffering and also into future rebirths. So then the verse more fully says, because the perfect Buddha, the perfect awakened one, has taught that the world has as its condition ignorance. So this here, now they're talking about the 12 links. So this ignorance is the misconception of I or mine. So based upon that, we engage in activities. Then we get these imprints on our mind stream. These imprints carry over in time. They don't disintegrate. They don't just go away. And even after the activity has ceased, we still have these imprints, and they're in like a causal form. They carry over into time, and then they are like the kind of the primary condition that out of which will arise another lifetime. And it happens like this. You have that condition in your mind stream, and then certain other conditions are present at the same time. And those are craving and grasping. So even the arhats have karma that hasn't been completely purified, but it never gets awakened. It never has the other conditions because they've gotten rid of all their afflictions. So this craving and grasping never comes up to like water the seeds of this causal kind of karma. So these craving and grasping are mental factors, and they kind of take an interest or a desire in when it relates to the 12 links, in giving up the set of aggregates that we have and then wanting to take another set. This is kind of what's happening. You can imagine that. You might get sick of this body when it's ready for it to go, and you might just think, let's go to another one. It's seeming a little more realistic to me this week than usual. You see, I think this is where I always run into problem with this part of Buddhism is always a little bit of a stretch for me. The mind jumping into a body is always like hard for my scientific mind for some reason, but it's starting to make a lot more sense. This is good. I've been staying with it. Okay, so this craving and grasping, these mental factors, these kind of intention or desire, they cause that imprint to within the consciousness to manifest its result. And what that is the arising of existence. This is the first state of rebirth in the subsequent life. So now we're kind of talking in the language of the 12 links. Existence is the condition for the arising of name and form, which is like the body and mind complex that's being reborn in the reborn being. That's the condition for the arising of the sense faculties. That's the condition for the arising of contact with objects now can happen. And with that, you go into what the translator uses the word sensation, where we use the word feeling, but I kind of liked having both, because it's like this contact between the senses faculties and the sense objects. We always have the feeling of pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral that right away goes into the next phase of that. It's hard, you can't really stop from contact to feeling, right? So he uses the word sensation. I found that helpful. So what he says then is, then suffering and all sorts of sensations arise, and the entire process of dependent origination perpetuates or cycles in that way. So then they go on and they complete this verse, which is, since the perfect Buddha taught that this world has ignorance as a condition, therefore, why is it not agreeable, not acceptable to say that this world is thought? So they're bringing the whole thing back around. They've kind of, with that one line there, that's actually one line, they've taught the whole thing about the 12 links and the whole thing about the kind of most subtle form of dependent arising. And so I like the way they do it. I found this helpful. So he's saying that what this is referring to here is that ignorance clings to its object, and it's clinging to it in a way in existing that they don't actually exist. The ignorance superimposes onto objects, a form of existence that's autonomous, an intrinsic existence, a sort of innate existence that they actually don't possess. So this ignorance is a misconception of things existing from their own side autonomously, when in fact they don't exist from their own side in this way, that ignorance conceives of them. So that being the case, if we say that things don't exist intrinsically, autonomously from their own side, then how is it that they actually exist? How is it that we can say things do exist? And then the answer that's given is that they're established by thought. And Chandakirti explains this. He says that the worlds which are not established by their own character or their own nature are explained as being merely designated by thought, merely conceived by thought. And then Aryadeva explains it in a way that I think is a little easier for my mind. He says, since it's the case that without thought, desire and so forth don't have any existence at all, who's that intelligent would hold both real objects and thought? So I'll read that again. Aryadeva is trying to help us to understand that things are merely designated by thought. And he says, since it's the case that without thought, desire and so forth don't have any existence at all, that we can grok, right? Without thought, how would you have any desire, right? I mean, come on. There would be no desire, there's no thought, okay? So that part my mind can kind of stay with. Since it's the case that without thought, desire and so forth don't have any existence at all, who that's intelligent would hold both real, objects and thought? There's the stretch. So what he's referring to here is that things that are established, they exist not from their own side, but they're established as they're posited by thought. It's through the force of thought that posits things' existence and establishing their existence. So it's not the case that things don't, yeah, I think that's pretty clear. Does that seem clear? I think it's clear. So then, with this kind of understanding, as we use various reasonings when we're doing meditation that's directed for wisdom, emptiness is now the object. And that using reasonings, we refute inherent existence. And then the meditator unites serenity and insight focused on the emptiness of the person or emptiness of other phenomena. And with that, they develop this tool where they can cleanse the mind of all the afflictions. And if they have all of the method side of the path complementing the wisdom side of the path, then they'll have all that they need to work towards completely eradicating all afflictions, all obscurations, both afflictive and cognitive obscurations. That's what I had to say about that. We're late. You can ask your questions next week to somebody who can answer them. Thank you for listening.